that caused a huge pileup in Tennessee. 99 vehicles crashed into each other, killing 12 and injuring 53. With an analysis of the incident, Dr. Bill Kramer from the University of Cincinnati.
Thanks, Ron. What you have to understand about this pileup is that it occurred in both the north and southbound lanes of Interstate 75 and stretched up and down the highway. But, as producer Nancy Higgins found out, responding fire departments had no way of knowing this when they arrived.
How far down does it go?
Who knows? I mean, they're screaming everywhere, and you hear, yeah, you can hear another tire squall and little explosions, and then more screams. I ran up on the bank up there, and the Lord delivered me.
You'd be driving and it was clear just like this, only cold in the morning, and then all of a sudden you hit fog, and then just right into that you saw brake lights, and you don't realize in the fog whether they're moving just slow or they're stopped, and then they're stopped. Everybody just kept hitting, and I was behind that car, and I could hear people just piling up behind, and I was trying not to get hit, so I just moved out and pulled up.
What did it sound like?
Just crash. Every few seconds you'd hear another crash, screeching and crash.
This stretch of I-75 between Chattanooga and Knoxville at mile marker 36 had been the site of accidents before. It crosses the Hiwassee River in a low-lying area of rural Tennessee. There's industry along that river. It's an area prone to thick, dense fog, and there are signs warning motorists as they approach. But many of the motorists are just tourists passing through. And on December 11th, there didn't seem to be any fog.
It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. It was clear to the east and to the west. It was just one area that was covered with real dense fog.
The Calhoun Volunteer Fire Department was first on scene. The main bulk of the pileup would end up being right under an overpass that led into Calhoun in the southbound lanes. But when Calhoun firefighters got there, they didn't know what or where it was.
There was a man standing in the road with his head cut all the way across the top, and blood was running all over his face. And we stopped to ask him, you know, what was going on, and he hollered, "Don't help me, help those people," and pointed down towards the interstate. But you couldn't see anything. You didn't know what was going on. And we asked him, well, you know, is it northbound lane or southbound lane? And he said, "Oh, God, it's everywhere."
There was so much involved, and it was so extensive. In order to really do a good command or be an instant commander, you've got to assess the problem and then try and respond your emergency personnel to the different factors involved. We were limited in our ability to make that assessment because of the fog.
Knight sent his firefighters into the wreckage to determine the extent of this pileup. At the same time, he began calling for mutual aid from surrounding departments and counties.
It was clear right on up through the warning signs. After we went through, we started finding the traffic backed up. As we got closer to the area, it was just like pulling a shade down, just like walking into a closet almost. It was very, very thick, just almost impossible to see across the interstate.
Athens responded from the north. The Cleveland Fire Department came in from the south, heading north in the southbound lanes to get to a truck carrying organic peroxide.
All the units coming from the south, which was Cleveland and Bradley County, were almost cut off by that truck because it had it's hard for me to describe, but the organic peroxide burns in a flare manner. And so you had like a large railroad flare that was burning about, I've heard different estimates. I thought it was probably burning about 75 to 100 feet high. Truly, it was an awesome sight, the actual fire from the truck.
There was constant explosions. The canisters themselves, to start with, maybe one of them caught on fire, and then it overheated the other one, and it exploded, and there were huge lids that would blow way up in the sky. I don't know how far because of the visibility, and they would come slamming back down.
And they couldn't see the cylinders coming back down. They got all victims away from the truck and decided to let it burn. They then started moving further into the wreckage from the south, as other firefighters did the same from the north. As responders began working their way through the wreckage, emergency operations centers away from the scene in both Bradley and McMinn counties began accumulating resources.
Emergency Operations Center is a place where government officials come and emergency responders. And what it is, it's a place where they sit down and they plan. They can talk to each other across the table. We have what we call a war room, but it's really a operations room. And we have 10 phones in there, and each one of them is a direct line. So therefore, those lines don't get clogged up during for the switchboard. But like a emergency operations center, of course, is the hub of the activity.
Separating the planning and logistics from the operations on scene left only rescuers and firefighters to find their way through the fog. 2 command posts had been set up to handle the massive pileup, but firefighters couldn't see them. They could only see what was right in front of them. The priority was getting to the victims and putting out spot fires. So, firefighters on both sides of the highway went to work on whatever they found as they searched the vehicles.
Is there someone in there? I don't know. I know he said he had 4 more bodies down here somewhere. He said he had 4 more bodies down here somewhere. Yeah.
The vehicles was stacked on top of each other. It was a very scary feeling to knowing that you was working in an area that you couldn't see 100 feet in front of you. Trying to find people that had ran off the road. You could hear people calling for help and you was trying to find them. Actually stumbling over some people, just trying to find your way up to vehicles. Trying to find vehicles that had people trapped in them. It was very terrifying.
Initially, going to where the loudest screams and cries for help were coming from, coincidentally, it turned out to be those happened to be the places where the most critical injuries were and where the worst entrapment problems were. There were a lot of walking wounded people that we would have one EMT get them in a cluster, tell them sit down, you're in a safe area, don't move, and then we'd get more help to them as help became available. But a lot of it, literally, you found the people by tripping over them. The fog and smoke combination was just incredibly thick, and it persisted for at least 2 hours into the incident.
During those first 2 hours, the fog presented command and communications problems.
When you're looking at EMS incident command, the primary things that you have to do are, number 1, locate all the patients. Number 2, you have to put them through the triage process so that you can figure out who's the most critical, who needs to get treated and get off the scene first. Then you have to provide transportation for all these people, and then you also have to include secondary searches to make sure you found everybody the first time. And in zero visibility, that's real tough to do.
Responders had to be careful. Ambulances were let in and out of the fog bank to transport the injured. Helicopters were forced to land on the outskirts of the scene to transport the critical patients to trauma centers. Those trauma centers were between 20 and 30 minutes away by air, and firefighters had to take painstaking steps with their apparatus.
It was a very slow process because of the visibility, but the incident went very good. Massive equipment was coming in from both directions. They was trying to be as safe as they could because we did have victims laying in the medium on the side. So it really posed a threat to the point where you just almost had to get out and walk beside the vehicle coming in and coming out, and we did quite often.
I do know that we've had 6 victims out off the scene so far.
Giving adequate care to the injured got easier as more resources arrived, but organizing those efforts and that equipment was no textbook operation.
The triage book says have an EMS commander, a triage officer, and a transportation officer as your minimum 3 commanders in EMS incident command. We did have a triage officer who was Dr. Jerry Devane. He's Bradley County's medical director, and he was one of the first responders on the scene. He realized very quickly that conventional triage was not going to work, and we threw the triage book out the window.
Okay, we want to make sure you have 3 together. Yeah, 3. I got 3 passengers in the vehicle.
Patients were tagged and treated where they were found. Some victims were trapped and couldn't be extricated right away. Searchers used different colors of surveyor's tape indicating that cars had been checked.
Red ribbon means that the vehicle's been searched. There's nobody inside.
The triage sector operated on a mobile basis with no central location until later in the incident. It was not an ideal system, but the incident itself was anything but ideal. Both command officers and firefighters found themselves forced to modify their actions to meet the demands of this incident and the needs of the victims. It crossed all areas of command for both the fire and EMS sides. In the fog, there was simply no way to visually command the scene. Under the shroud of fog, command did its best to account for all operations. They gave out assignments by radio and used audible locations instead of visual ones. This became fundamental to the triage operation.
We also agreed in what we've now called what we did as blindfold triage. And this is an audibly rather than visually run triage system. If you're going to set up a triage point, you have to be able to tell everybody where it is. And if you can't see, if you don't have any visual reference points, that's a real big problem, and as it was at Calhoun. So what happened was Dr. Devane actually did a recon of most of the southbound accident and then picked an area close to where the worst injuries were, and it happened to be one of the few places you could see more than just a couple inches because there were a lot of fires around it, so it lit it up a little bit. And then he coordinated the triage and the initial transportation from his portable radio, and he directed people with things like go to where the white pickup is stuck under the red tractor trailer. You have 2 criticals pinned in that pickup. Or go next to where the blue Volkswagen is on fire. You have a burn patient laying in the median about 10 yards away, and that type of thing.
Loosely termed, the blindfold triage system, as part of the overall incident command system, provided EMS responders with guidance in an area that stretched over 500 yards. It's important to remember that until the fog lifted, no one knew exactly how far the pileup stretched, the number of vehicles, or what those vehicles contained.
There were several trucks loaded with different things. There was one loaded with grapes, fresh grapes, you know, a whole tractor trailer turned over and grapes spilled everywhere. And there was one with
beer bottles,
empty beer bottles. And there was one full of powdered detergent.
Christmas trees.
And one big trailer load of fresh Christmas trees.
Just anything you can imagine we had it, where we ran into propane tanks, and it was almost like you looked at a propane tank just like it wasn't even there. And where if that would have been the only situation that we had, we'd have went to.
It would have been the center of attention. But this particular day, we didn't worry about it.
So what was the center of your attention, if you had to nail one down?
I guess my center of attention was the only way that, I don't know if it's actually my center of attention, but the only way that I feel that you can evaluate the scene as a whole was how quickly did the persons that were injured receive treatment.
Over 50 patients had been packaged and transported in the first 90 minutes. It was another half hour before the fog began to lift, unveiling the magnitude of this wreck.
I believe if we had seen the accident in daylight with no fog, it would probably been a very traumatic effect on all of us, because we was working with what we could see at the time and just working our way up to the mass of the accident itself.
Emergency workers were amazed at the size of the pileup. They had been concentrating on small parts of the overall scene. With the sun returning, coordination became clear, and responders continued on with the tasks involved with this tragedy.
Where's he at?
All right, we're ready to go get sick.
Ready to go get sick?
Yeah,
okay,
with our stokes.
We have a... Okay, here's the body. All? Go ahead and bring them out in the body bag. Chief. Okay, yes, sir. You got 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
12 people lost their lives at this mass casualty incident, and as cleanup continued for days, it became painfully clear to both citizens and responders that this disaster could happen to anyone.
The biggest thing I saw was concern for those people. Of course, we had some local people that were involved in it, not many, But when you have, you can imagine going from here to visit someone across the country, and in the middle of nowhere, you know nobody, you don't know where you're at. All you know is that you're at the Calhoun exit in Tennessee, and all of a sudden your life is just ripped from you almost, and you're standing out on the side of the interstate, and we've got some people around here that really try to help people in that situation. That's what emergency services is all about. It's helping people. That's what it is. Lives and property, but lives first of all.
It just so happened it was there. They've had accidents all over the United States since then that, of course, maybe hasn't been to this magnitude, but on an interstate highway, it's very possible.
I don't care where a mass casualty incident happens. Nobody can handle it by themselves. A lot of people that say, oh yeah, we have a disaster plan, we do disaster drills, they only do it within their immediate local area or within their agency, and those things just aren't realistic when you really do have the big one. What you need to do is have interagency region-wide drills, particularly if you're in a rural area, and you have to realize that it's going to take you a while to get resources in, and this was really a sensory deprivation problem as well as a mass casualty incident. Those type of things, are not going to happen everywhere, but they can happen to anybody. Even if it's just at night in a remote area where you can't get portable lighting in. So I would say if you have the potential for serious weather emergencies or fog, blizzards, dust storms, night in remote areas, to look at the blindfold triage, which is still set up your command system, but be able to coordinate it by radio, and you really have to plan and train in order to make it work.
The training and drills these agencies participated in just weeks prior to the incident proved invaluable when at the scene, but they also say it was the ability to improvise that made the difference here. In Calhoun, Tennessee, I'm Nancy Higgins for American Heat.
Bill, obviously the fog on I-75 created big problems for personnel. What about the need to improvise under very uncertain conditions such as these?
That was a key point, Ron. The need for improvisation was critical at this incident. We heard the EMS chief talk about the blindfold incident command using audible cues as opposed to visual ones. Not only in fog conditions, but maybe in dust storms out west or dark and hazy conditions that you could find anywhere, the need for this blindfold incident command could be quite critical. I feel it's good to have the fundamental incident command system tempered by the unique needs of the situation and a realization by personnel at all levels in command that what they face on the scene is likely to be different from what they've recreated in training sessions.
Coming up on American Heat.